As a male, there's a huge amount of pressure put on you to identify as a feminist, or at the very least some kind of feminist ally. Now, if you don't feel that you are a feminist or a feminist ally, you'll be shamed to a high degree. You'll be called a misogynist, someone who hates women, or just someone who's got a little dick, or someone who's afraid of women. Now, for all that's worth, I'm still glad that I'm male and not a female, because females are put under that same pressure that any woman who doesn't identify as a feminist, she'll be shamed way more. Feminists currently call women who don't identify as feminists lap bitches. So, if you don't support everything that feminism does, you're a lap bitch. Now, the reason behind this that feminists will say is that feminism has, fought for rights for women, and that by abandoning feminism now, you're really turning your back on something that, that got you your rights. Now, if that woman turns around and says, well, look, feminism has lost its way and it's become a destructive force in society, those women will be told, okay, well, it's lost its way. It'll find its way again. Now, for me, I think that kind of misses a point here, and that's a point about accountability, that when things, lose their way, one could ask whether it was just always going to happen, that it was always going to lose its way. And I think it's also valid to ask whether or not it will find its way back again. I think, looking at how things are in 2018, feminism has probably done way more damage to women than had it have not existed at all. Now, that's my opinion, and I'm sure it's not most people's opinion, but, that's kind of how I see it. Now, what I want to talk about is, the merits of feminism to start with. The arguments behind whether feminism had merit. Now, if we look at gender as something that identifies a person, now, from my perspective, my parents were both white. So there was 100% chance that I would be born white. Now, if my parents were both black, there'd be 100% chance that I'd be black. Now, if my parents were working class, then, I would be born into a working class family. If they were wealthy, I'd be born into a wealthy family. That's just kind of how it goes. Now, at my conception, the only real variable was my gender. There was a little bit less than a 50% chance that I would be born male, but really it comes down to 50-50. It was a crapshoot whether or not I became a male or a female. So to argue that, when I was born male, that I should somehow inherit all of the sins of every man who came before me is nonsense. That, okay, I can entertain the idea that if I'm born white, and, white people are oppressors of non-whites, then I can entertain the idea that being born white is my lineage, that I've benefited from, the lineage of my white ancestors. But I didn't have exclusively male ancestors. I didn't have exclusively female ancestors. I had an equal number of both. And, when it came down to my own birth, it was a 50-50 chance. I ended up being male. I could have equally been female. Now, if you ask a feminist, and I've done this quite a lot, sell feminism to me. Tell me what feminism has done for women. At best, I've got 4 responses back. Now, the one that everyone gives is voting. Women having the right to vote. That's pretty much universal. The second one is the sexual revolution, that women have been sexually liberated. The third one is that, in the past, unmarried mothers, young mothers, have had children taken off them. And the fourth one is that women used to earn less. Feminists will argue that they still earn less, but in the past that's been official. There was a minimum wage for men and women, and for women it was less. Now let's just go through those 4, major achievements of feminism and look at them one by one. Now, as far as voting goes, only pre 1910 or the early 1900s, only rich people could vote. Now, I didn't come from a rich family, so if I was born back then, I wouldn't have been able to vote any more than a woman would have been able to vote. And if I follow my lineage back, I can have a claim to the fact that my people were oppressed because, both my working class male and female ancestors, they weren't allowed to vote. Now, as far as gender goes, really the argument that all women weren't allowed to vote, which, that varies from place to place. In the United States, in some places women were allowed to vote. But let's say we use the United Kingdom, where my ancestors come from. Well, a very small percentage of society got to vote. Now, that's not my fault as a male that 100 years ago, women were not allowed to vote, because guess what? I wouldn't have been allowed to vote then anyway. Now, so firstly, I could, as a male, it's very tempting to say, well, look, men had to fight in wars, and if I was born back then, I would have had my head blown off in a trench. And not only would I have had my head blown off in a trench, I would have had some suffragette handing out white feathers to me to shame me into fighting. I could blame women for that. But really, I'll blame those women for that. I think those women were scum. But that was those women. It's not my wife, and it's not my grandmother or anybody else. It's those women who did it. So I think, women have to get their head out of the headspace that somehow all men oppress them because of what happened 100 years ago. Equally, men have to get their head out of the headspace that, women today somehow oppress them because they didn't. The only people who oppressed people back then, rich people oppressed poor people, and most people were poor. So if you come from a rich family, maybe you have some blame for it. But if you come from a poor family, you don't. So really, the whole voting thing, I think, is ridiculous. And if you add to that, most feminists these days are communists, and when there's an election, they don't respect the outcome anyway. Look at this last election in the United States. Donald Trump won fair and square, but straight away, feminists were out in the streets protesting that he had no legitimacy. So, these people, they have no respect for democracy anyway. So if you're going to claim that you were oppressed because you couldn't vote, at least show some respect for democracy, and then people might take you seriously. Now, okay, voting. I don't think voting is such a great win for feminism, but anyway, let's move on. Now, we move on to, what was the second one? It'll come to my head shortly. Okay, we'll go to children being taken off unwed mothers. Now, that's abhorrent. That should never have happened. But really, I think we need to look at where those children were being sent. And those children were being sent to wealthy families where women couldn't have children. So this was really one woman stealing another woman's child, and because she couldn't have children. Now, we're starting to see that happen again, which is alarming. But really, I don't see how men benefit from that. Now, men might have been complicit, but really, men are no more responsible for that happening than women. And at the time, women voted, so everyone has to take responsibility for that. But who we don't hear about are the men who had their children taken off them. Now, even today, a man can have, a woman can put a child up for adoption without the father knowing. And even if the father wants that child, it's too late. It's reported, quite often here in the United States that, the father will be there for the birth of his child and have every expectation that he's the father and want to bring the child up. And behind his back, the mother will sign the child over to an adoptive couple, and the father doesn't know. And basically, by the time he finds out, which is when the child's being taken away, the time has elapsed for him to put protests in. So the natural father of the child who wants to raise the child has his child taken off him. And that's happening today. This isn't the 1960s, this is today. And you hear nothing from feminists about that. Because for them, they believe that a woman has the right to put her child up for adoption without the father having any say in it. And I just can't understand that. But if you go back to the 1960s, I think there's an idea that every father was some deadbeat father that didn't want to have anything to do with the child. When you think teenage mothers, there would have been a teenage father, and, teenage couples are often very, very in love. That father never got to see his child. The couple probably had plans together. So if the child was taken off the mother, if she was drugged and it was taken off the mother, it's a very good chance that the mother and father both had plans to raise the child together. So not only did the woman lose the child, but the father lost the child too, but we never hear about that. And I think that says a lot about feminism, that there's just no sympathy there for what happened to the father. I think, feminists today seem to think that children are a form of property of the woman. And, so really to argue that, that somehow men were responsible for children being taken off teenage mothers, I think just misses the whole point once again. Now, if we look at, and I'm trying to remember what that second one was. Let's move on to the last one, and hopefully the second one comes back to me. If we look at wages, so, and it is true that, in the 1950s and 60s and probably before that, officially there was a different minimum wage for men and for women. Now, if for a single woman, that must have been really irritating. But if you look, firstly, I'll say I run a business, and I see so many young people back in Australia who are just sitting at home, not able to get a job. And, I could give them an opportunity. But the reality is that if I employed those people, I would have to pay them $18 an hour. And really, these are people with next to no skills. I would have to deprogram them from what they learn at school. That really, as a burden on my business, I just can't afford to pay someone $18 an hour to teach them from scratch. And, I'd have to teach these people, basics like you don't bring an iPad to work and sit there and watch a movie all day. So really, maybe if the minimum wage for these people was $5 or $6 an hour, I could give them an opportunity and I could churn through 100 of them until I found the right one. Now, if women back in the 1950s and 60s were entering the workforce, really, has it ever occurred to people that them being paid a lower minimum wage, and that's presuming that everyone was on the minimum wage, didn't provide opportunities for them, didn't encourage businesses to employ women where maybe they would not have employed women, and that soon after, there was parity in wages, and it became illegal for anyone to discriminate based on gender. Now, feminists will say that there's a gender pay gap, and we could have that discussion for hours. But the reality is that there's no official form of discrimination. In fact, anyone who discriminates will get in a whole load of trouble. Now, opportunities aside, back then, we lived in traditional societies based around the family. Now, has it not occurred to these people that there was only a certain number of jobs, and that if women earned the same amount as men, that there just wouldn't be enough jobs for people? During the Depression, there wasn't enough jobs for men. So if women flooded the workforce, who was going to suffer? It wasn't going to be the man. If the man could jump on a train, head out into the country some side, get a job, bumming around, he'd be quite happy, I can assure you. But his 10 kids at home and his wife, they wouldn't be so happy because they'd be starving. So, to argue that, somehow men were advantaged and women were disadvantaged by men having a higher wage, and that disincentivized women from working, just misses the whole point, that the main beneficiary of men having a higher wage was children and women, because that's how our society worked. Now, for better or worse, that's just how society's worked for a long time. Now, if I go back, I've got to come up with this, otherwise I look like an idiot. Voting. I've done voting. I've done teenage mothers, and I've done wages. The sexual revolution, the good old sexual revolution. Now, if you do any reading on sexuality, when people were living traditional lives, where there was a man and a woman and technically they weren't having sex until they were married, that was just how our society worked. Now, that was pre-World War II. When World War II hit, men and women were separated and promiscuity went through the roof. It's completely documented. So 1945, by the end of the war, I think the number of sexual partners men and women had went from like 1 on average to 4. People were fucking their way around the war. So if anyone's going to take credit for the sexual revolution, it's not feminism, it's Hitler. Whoever caused the war was the person who caused the sexual revolution. And then as a result of the sexual revolution, you then had contraception being developed, because, people were more, you really didn't have a whole lot of need for contraception when, people were married and the goal of society was to populate the planet. But, when the population grew and people weren't getting married anymore, there was a need for contraception. I didn't see how feminism had anything to do with that. Now, ironically, a big gripe of feminism is that men just swoop in and take away credit from women. Really, I haven't seen that in my life. In fact, I see a whole lot of feminists swooping in. I've seen feminists argue that Albert Einstein wasn't really all that smart and that he just stole all of his ideas off his wife. Now, there's no evidence to this, but feminists have no problem taking credit off, the greatest mind that probably ever lived. But for feminists to claim that feminism somehow caused the sexual revolution, it's just absolute nonsense. They didn't. And, I think we could reach a point in our society as people go back to these, they call them tradcon lives, that, people will be cursing the sexual revolution. That, people are more unhappy today than they have ever been. We're now going from a point where, there's a huge problem of male suicide to now girls killing themselves as well and women killing themselves. And maybe a lot of this has to do with the fact that, people are spending their lives on Tinder now, and, women are finding that they hit, their mid-30s, and men are just happy to play the field of Tinder. There's nothing in it for them anymore. That, what do they say? Well, why buy milk when the cow's given away? That really, for feminism to claim that it caused the sexual revolution, or that even the sexual revolution was necessarily a good thing, it's not a selling point of feminism for me. So, in summary, I'd love for someone to sell feminism to me, just as an exercise. Sell it to me. What's great about feminism? What did it do that wasn't going to happen anyway? But what happens is when I start talking to women about this, and I do it respectfully, and I put these points, the points that I put in this video, they just shut down. They just say, oh, that's what a man would say, you're mansplaining. And really, there's no way, they're not even challenging their own ideas, that as soon as you challenge them, they just go, yeah, well, I don't know, I'm just a feminist, get over it. Well, really, I think feminists need to ask themselves, the damage that they're doing to society now, the damage that they're doing to women. If you look at, say, the Me Too movement, I know men now who, when they book an Uber, if they get a female driver, they'll cancel the female driver because they don't want to be sitting in a cab casually talking to a woman about something that is completely socially acceptable today, and have a video emerge or a recording emerge in 20 years' time of them talking about something that in 20 years' time is not socially acceptable. So, if female Uber drivers are earning less than their male counterparts, Me Too isn't helping that. That, it's damaging women. As men are finding out the things that feminists have been saying about them for generations, men are starting to get contempt for women. And that's just not going to help anybody. So, this is why, personally, I don't identify as a feminist, and I can't see myself ever identifying as a feminist. That I have a lot of anti-feminist friends, and really, I am an anti-feminist. And I don't think there's a problem with being an anti-feminist. Any movement should have a counter movement which is there to keep the movement honest. So really, I think you'll find most anti-feminists know more about feminism than the majority of feminists. So, as in male society, we as men get better by being challenged. A man who can come in who is our peer, who can challenge our thinking or challenge us physically, are what make us better men. Well, maybe feminists should start welcoming anti-feminists and let anti-feminists challenge their views. What are they afraid of?